Good morning. I truly would like to give thanks and praise to God first and foremost for this opportunity to deliver the convocation address. I praise the God who is able to do exceeding abundantly above all that I've ever asked or even thought. I want to express my gratitude to our president, Michael Jenkins, the academic dean, David Hester, for extending me this invitation. To my faculty colleagues, administrators, staff, and students, I send you greetings and express my gratitude for sharing this special moment with me. And on a personal note, I would like to say to the students of this seminary that getting to know your seminary professor can change your life for the better. Getting to know Susan Garrett and Marty Swords, Diane Reichstroffer, former professors Stephen Ray and Dale Andrews changed my life. And whatever good comes of my scholarship will be partly because of the investment they made in me, believing in the call, challenging me to be faithful to my calling as both a minister and a scholar. And I would like to extend a word of thanks to those professors and all they invested in me. And now to my lecture, Hell on Earth. In this pericope, we are introduced to two persons who led very different lives. The rich man fared well in this life. In verses 19 and 20, we are told that he dressed in purple and fine linen, feasted sumptuously every day, and a poor man was laid at his gate. Now, in contrast to the good life that the rich man lived, Lazarus, the other person in the story, did not fare well. In verses 20 and 21, we find that Lazarus is crippled, poor, covered with sores, hungry, and ironically, only consoled by the dogs that came and licked his sores. 2 points stand out for our consideration. First, Luke uses the contrast in their lives to emphasize the dramatic reversal they will experience in the afterlife. There are two persons in the story. One is very rich and the other is very poor. One person experiences joy in this life while the other lives in misery. He does this because reversal is an important theological issue. In the Lucan account of the teachings of Jesus, the last in this life will be first in the afterlife, and the first in this life will be last or left out altogether. Abraham reminded the rich man of this very fact in verse 25 when he said, "Son, remember that in this life you received your good things, fine clothes, lavish feasts, and neglect of the poor. And Lazarus, in like manner, bad things, crippled, poor, sick, and hungry." Because of these very different lives, Abraham explains to the rich man that now Lazarus is comforted and you suffer pain. Luke draws the stark contrast of their fates in the afterlife, employing the apocalyptic image of hell from the Greek word Hades, which in ancient literature refers to the underworld, the netherworld, or the place of departed spirits. Interestingly, both the rich man and Lazarus live in this other realm called Hades, but lead very different lives. In Hades, Lazarus is now comforted in Abraham's bosom, while the rich man suffers pain. Second, biblical scholars often focus on Luke's interest in the poor and critique of the rich as major literary themes. In chapter 6, verses 20 and 24, Jesus pronounces a blessing on the poor and promises them the kingdom of God, and a woe on the rich because they already have received comfort. The story of the rich fool in chapter 12, verses 15 through 21. And later the story of the rich young ruler in chapter 18, verses 18 through 27, are examples of this theme. Some scholars and theologians also use this text as a witness about the permanence of judgment, as well as the reality and danger of hell as the final abode of the wicked. The rich man is often the prototypical example of a sinful or willfully obstinate person destined for an eternity in hell's flames. This text, along with other New Testament texts like Matthew 25, 2 Thessalonians 1:9, and Revelation 20, verse 11 through 15, form an eschatological core that undergirds this belief. But my interest in this text as a biblical and black religious scholar is not on the theme of eschatological reversal, Luke's critique of the rich, or the belief in hell as the final abode of the wicked, however churches define it. Instead, I am interested in the suffering of Lazarus in this life as a form of hell on earth. And I ask the following: what would happen if the focus of this text shifted from the terrifying image of hell in the afterlife to the image of hell in this life? I believe that a different focus could yield the church considerable benefit as we confront the hopelessness and meaninglessness that is plaguing our world, much of which stems from suffering. This crisis is not eschatological, but existential. Not the hereafter, but the right now. A new focus should give considerable reflection on the hard life of Lazarus, a life so difficult that in the afterlife he had to be consoled and not rewarded as in other gospel parables. For Lazarus, the afterlife is a place of consolation because of the suffering, and I would say because of the hell he experienced on earth. And so this text invites us to think deeply about the hard life of Lazarus and is a helpful beginning point to think about the suffering of others in this life. This lecture is a product of a 3-year journey I have been on as a pastor of 19 years and a young scholar. I have been studying nihilism in America, particularly its complex manifestations in the African American community. And I have found 2 things that I want to share with you this morning. First, I'm not the first person to apply the imagery of hell to suffering in this life. African Americans have been doing it for centuries, going back to the slave era, and even through the turbulent years of segregation through leaders such as Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Interestingly, in the post-civil rights era, this idea has been given less attention by black theologians and religious scholars, but is pervasive in both hip-hop and pop culture in movies such as Baby Boy, starring Tyrese Gibson, and Faster, starring Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. While the understanding of hell on earth has pervaded African American hip-hop and pop culture, the church has largely ignored this image and resultantly failed to draw upon it as a resource for biblical interpretation, constructive theology, and preaching. Therefore, my aim today is to introduce this image and its usage with hopes that it will spur further study. For the sake of brevity, I will only discuss the belief in hell on earth from the slave era and hip-hop culture. The second thing I want to share is why this belief is important. It is important because of how the term is used and what it signifies. Hell on earth is a historic term used to give language to one of the cruelest forms of oppression in human history. And in the contemporary era, it's a descriptive term emanating from a culture dealing with chaotic and dire social conditions. But it also signifies that there is a real crisis of hope and meaning in this country. This crisis of meaning is a sign of nihilism. And I believe when there is hell on earth, nihilism emerges. And therefore, I will conclude the lecture with a brief reference of my encounter with nihilism as a pastor and the work of Cornel West on this issue. In contrast to biblical texts that associate hell with the afterlife, for enslaved Africans, hell functions as an image of the present life and the afterlife. Enslaved Africans reinterpreted both the traditional and distorted teachings of hell they were introduced to by white Christians, so that it gave meaning to their experience of human enslavement. For example, blacks were taught that if they were good slaves, they would go to heaven and when they died, but if they were bad slaves, when they died, they would go to hell. This was particularly problematic because it forced them to accept slavery as a permanent part of their lives, with also the possibility of further suffering after death. Because of teachings like these, a different conceptualization of hell was required that provided meaning and hope in this life. And so enslaved Africans believed that hell can be experienced in this life, hell experienced on earth. And blacks did not completely reject the belief in hell as the eternal abode of the unrighteous as they were taught by white Christians. For example, the Negro spiritual, "I Got a Home in That Rock," reflects this belief, drawing on the biblical story of Lazarus and the rich man in Luke chapter 16. The hymn says, "Well, a poor Lazarus, as poor as I, and when he died, he had a home on high. He had a home in that rock, don't you see? The rich man died and lived so well, and when he died, he had a home in hell. He had no home in that rock. You better get a home in that rock, don't you see?" This hymn is an example of their acceptance of the belief in hell and the afterlife, particularly for those not in that rock, which is a reference to Jesus Christ and the experience of conversion. Now, in addition to the understanding of hell as a place of suffering and punishment in the afterlife, blacks also believe that the experience of hell is not reserved for just the afterlife. Hell can be and is a present reality. And for many blacks during the 18th and 19th centuries, slavery was hell. As one female enslaved African recalled in a narrative of her life, "Them days was hell without fire." The section of her narrative that discusses hell reflects a sophisticated interpretation in which there is a hell with fire and a hell without fire. The hell with fire is in the afterlife. The hell without fire is in this life. Now, removing the fire was an important interpretive move that rejected any idea that their suffering was a judgment from God. For example, the curse of Ham was a popular belief used to support the enslavement of Africans. So this woman's statement radically alters this theological vision. No, blacks were experiencing hell without fire, while white slavers would experience hell with fire in the afterlife. Enslaved Africans' understanding of hell is similar to Luke's story of eschatological reversal. Even Howard Thurman's study of Negro spirituals found similar beliefs. When dealing with the fate of master and slave in this life and the afterlife, Thurman pointed out that enslaved Africans believed they were experiencing hell on earth, and when they died, they would go to heaven. But they also believed that the master is experiencing heaven now, and when the master dies, the master goes to hell. This is an altogether different eschatological vision than what the slave catechists were teaching. Enslaved Africans' belief greatly resembles the reversal we see with the rich man and Lazarus. And we see this belief being traced not only in the slave era, we see it through segregation, but I also want to spend some time reflecting upon this idea of hell on earth in hip-hop culture. Even in hip-hop and pop culture, hell is used as a metaphor to describe the realities of inner-city life. Rappers such as Eric B., Talib Kweli, and Eminem are examples of this belief. Eric B's rap song entitled "I Ain't No Joke" says, taking a walk through his neighborhood was likened to taking a walk through hell. Feed your dome and watch your eyes swell, he says. The indication here is clear that any reasonable person would be appalled and amazed at the realities confronting blacks in the inner cities. A walk through what Eric B. says, hell, is a mind-blowing and eye-raising experience. Kawili's rap song entitled Give 'Em Hell, the chorus chants, it's all going to hell, it's all going to hell. Yep, we living in hell. Yep, they giving us hell. It's all going to hell. Here Kawili makes the claim that they are living in hell. But the verses give a strong indication that he is challenging the belief that heaven and hell exist in the afterlife. Instead, he argues, hell exists right now and they are living in it. He says, they say hell is underground and heaven is in the sky. And they say that's where you go when you die. But how they know? Instead, he says, I have learned that heaven and hell exist right here on earth. Word. Raekwon's debut single entitled Heaven and Hell says, what do you believe in, heaven or hell? You don't believe in heaven because we're living in hell. You see the same theme in the rap song by the Wu-Tang Clan, Wu Revolution, that says hell is not below, but hell is what you're going through. So in rap music, hell is an apropos image and description of the harsh realities they experience. One can only imagine the realities that give rise to the belief that they are experiencing hell. Even in movies depicting aspects of black life, this belief is latent. For example, in the movie Baby Boy, actress Taraji P. Henson played a mother who told her son, played by actor Tyrese Gibson, what to pray for as he attempted to negotiate the difficulties and dangers of the inner city. And her words allude to life in terms of being hell-like. And she says, and quit all this talking about dying. Ain't nobody getting ready to die no time soon, baby. You know, you don't know what kind of cards life is going to deal you. All you need to do is to try to be happy while you're here on earth. And hope to God there's another place that's better than this. And hope that Jesus will let your ass in on Judgment Day. But while you're down here, you better watch your back. While the mother did not tell her son that they were living in hell, her words at least suggest that it is a hell-like condition. She mentions a better place, which is a clear allusion to heaven, and that one enters this better place after an encounter with Jesus on Judgment Day. Hope is therefore lodged in the possibility that if they survive the hell-like conditions of the inner city, they may go to heaven. It is also important that she characterizes their present experience as containing the following elements: the imminence of death, uncertainty, absence of full happiness, despair, and suspicion. This inner city mother follows a long tradition of African Americans who interpret the sufferings of slavery, segregation, and the chaos of the inner cities as a form of hell on earth. Let me summarize this section. The belief in a present hell is pervasive in African American culture, in slave narratives, black religious literature, and rap music. 3 points are in order here. First, it is important to mention that blacks chose in history and continue to choose the term hell to describe their experience in America. As such, hell is a term that emanates out of the language of the culture, and careful attention needs to be given to its usages and meaning. Second, it is quite possible that the significance of the term hell in hip-hop and pop culture is missed because of the assumption that it is merely a popular or slang term. Hell may function in this capacity on some level, but I believe references about a hellish experience betray a sincere and deep belief that the social realities confronting millions in inner cities are dire. Third, voices from hip-hop culture describing their communities as a living hell characterized by pain, abandonment, and hopelessness gives evidence of a social and moral crisis that the church needs to pay attention to and address. The church should understand the theological weight behind the word hell and people in culture using the term in ways to talk about suffering. Let me move this toward a conclusion. This study is not merely an attempt to examine a provocative issue, but emerges partly from my work as a minister in African American churches in Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. I began to encounter an internal apathy and cancer that is eating away at people while I served as a pastor. And it is not just social inequities, but a deeper problem, one that is spiritual, psychological, emotional. And it appears that centuries of racial oppression, the same oppression that many have called hell on earth, has produced a new form of nihilism in America. I have witnessed the despair that permeates black communities. I have repeatedly met African Americans who are resigned to accept the status quo instead of working for change. I have worked with African Americans who ironically hold a deep suspicion and hatred of their own culture and people. I have encountered African Americans who ignore, actively resist, or undermine projects and leaders who are working to improve their own communities. I have talked with able-bodied men who have no desire to work. I have worked with young people who lack self-esteem and the desire to expand their mind and opportunities for life through education. And worse yet, I have attended too many funerals of young black men and women who died as victims of violence, many times at the hands of other African Americans, or worse yet, by their own hands. One could argue that the African American community is not suffering and dying because of a lack of vision, but because of the absence of hope upon which that vision ultimately rests. What is so troubling about these forms of social passivity, self-defeating actions and lifestyles, and violence that I encountered in my work is that they work against the change so desperately needed in our communities. And accepting injustice as normative, participating in undermining one's own community, and committing acts of violence are counterproductive responses from persons within the black community who are deeply frustrated, sad, depressed, and angry. And I believe that this internal deterioration, latent in the African American community, is a product of nihilism. And my experience as a minister and educator in the African American community is emblematic of a pervasive problem that others have already begun to recognize and address in their respective works. The first to view nihilism as a major issue in the black community was Cornel West. His work is important because it makes the connection between the crisis of hope in the black community and the emergence of nihilism. In Race Matters, West puts his finger on the despair that manifests itself when there is hell on earth. He says, and I quote, "To talk about depressing statistics of unemployment, infant mortality, incarceration, teenage pregnancy, and violent crime is one thing. But to face up to the monumental eclipse of hope, the unprecedented collapse of meaning, and the incredible disregard for human life and property in much of Black America is something else." See, for West, the real issue confronting the black community is not merely structural inequities, as the liberals argue, or lack of morals and a work ethic, as conservatives would contend. But rather, West says, the profound sense of psychological depression, personal worthlessness, and social despair that is widespread in Black America. Now, he does not use the term nihilism in the same manner as Friedrich Nietzsche or other European nihilists who believe authority, values, and ideals are not grounded in objective reality, who reject all belief in universals, and who are deeply skeptical and pessimistic, all of which are intricately tied to the dominance of Christianity in the West. But instead, West uses the term in a different manner to describe what emerges as a result of centuries of racism and the eventual breakdown of cultural buffers in the black community. Nihilism in Black America emanates from what West refers to as the lived experience of coping with a life of horrifying meaninglessness, hopelessness, and lovelessness. That sounds like hell to me. And results in a growing number of blacks with a numbing detachment from others and a self-destructive disposition toward the world. His thinking on this issue provided considerable insight into the internal breakdown of black spirits that I encountered as a pastor. So the implications are profound both for the black community and our nation as a whole. In sum, nihilism possibly represents a major shift in the African American narrative that began with centuries of slavery, segregation, freedom movements, and full integration into society. In contrast to the story of resilience and survival, nihilism threatens to disrupt this narrative as a large segment of the black populace face severe fragmentation, survival, and death. We may possibly be witnessing the demise of a large segment of the black community, at least the early stages. Secondly, nihilism represents the ultimate telos of racial oppression, which is not only the external subjugation of black people, but the internal breakdown of black institutions and spirits. We are witnessing the effect of centuries of oppression on black institutions and particularly vulnerable persons within the black community. I define nihilism as the internalization of oppression. And in particular, nihilism has led to an increasing number of blacks who internalize despair, self-hatred, and inferiority. And worse yet, once internalized, blacks participate in their own oppression, thereby sustaining the power and the permanence of racism. And much of the social isolationism, black-on-black crime, political, moral, and social irresponsibility, and religious chicanery that we see in the black community are all products of nihilism. Thirdly, the nihilism that I have encountered in the African American community is our problem. The issue of nihilism is important for African Americans, European Americans, Latina Americans, and Native Americans. We live and serve in racially integrated neighborhoods and are all interconnected and interdependent. What affects one segment of the population affects every segment of the population. So nihilism is not just a problem in the black community, but it is a national crisis. You even see the trajectory of West's work. He begins with race matters and moves to democracy matters. And in both of those books, he talks about nihilism. Fourthly, I have found the work of Cornel West to be invaluable because it helps me to understand the hopelessness people feel that makes them describe their lives as hell on earth. Now, in my culture, racial oppression continues to affect a large number of African Americans. But other forms of oppression that lead to suffering and nihilism deserve our attention as well. Because these other forms of suffering that stems from gross poverty, gender discrimination, create hellish conditions for others as well. Last but certainly not least, West's work is invaluable because it reveals the connection between the hopeless hell of an experience and the destructive mindset that it produces in some. Listen to this point. The church cannot ignore or avoid the nihilistic threat. Unlike Lazarus, who sat dormant at the gate, the Lazaruses of today are increasingly making the choice to express their misery in destructive ways. Instead of sitting by the gate, they choose to break the gate down. Unlike the rich man whose wealth provided isolation from the misery of Lazarus, no community today is isolated from nihilism's effect. Nihilistic persons act out in a myriad of ways that negatively affect our communities. Therefore, I hope that the church is up to the challenge of confronting the realities of hell on earth with hope, realism, compassion, and generosity. Thank you.